Okay, go ahead.
My name is Tor Arsala. I'm with the Democratic Youth Coalition. I am the outreach director. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. I'll turn it over to my colleague Ashi to introduce herself.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My name's Ashi. I'm the Chief of Staff for the Democratic Youth Coalition. We're a grassroots student activist coalition of young Democrats who are working to help elect candidates passionate about serving the American public. The youth vote, as you all know, is extremely important, and our work will ensure that the Democratic Party continues to receive strong youth and student engagement. Since this is a Democratic primary, we cannot endorse any candidate in any primary race, as we would like to facilitate discussion and provide a platform to all. And thank you so much. We're very excited to introduce Hannah Kinder here today, running for the Virginia House of Delegates. Very excited for you to be here today, and excited to learn more about your platform.
Right, well, we're going to get started with the questions. If you want to participate, please turn on your camera, mute if you're not speaking. We'll be recording this meeting to post on social media, so please adjust your cameras accordingly. Finally, we ask that you please do not promote yourselves in the chat or on the call. With that being said, Hannah, welcome. First of all, thank you for joining us. If you can tell us more about yourself and how great it is to be a single candidate in the Democratic election this year.
Sure. Thank you all so much for having me. I was thrilled when you reached out. This is so exciting. So I'm just really thankful and blessed to be here. So a little bit about myself. I live in Norfolk, Virginia now, which most people haven't heard of, but if you've heard of Virginia Beach, we're right next door. So we're the next city over. I grew up in Scottsdale, Arizona, and I spent my time there mostly playing outside and really learning to love nature and learning about all of the various indigenous cultures that live in that area or stem from that area. And that was my first real intro into activism and into environmental justice. When I was in second grade, I rallied all my fellow second graders and my teacher together during our climate change and environmental unit, and convinced them to let me build 200 solar ovens and taught everyone how to make hot dogs in solar ovens and fed the entire second grade. So I went on from there. We ended up moving back to Virginia, where my parents are from, when I was about to go into high school. I was in 7th or 8th grade. And that was the first moment I think I realized that inequity exists in the world. And, I grew up surrounded by beautiful Black and brown people that were my family, because we were completely displaced from our biological family as they all lived on the East Coast. So my aunts and uncles growing up were immigrants, people from all over the world, of all colors, of all backgrounds. And that was just who my family was. It wasn't until I moved back east that I realized most communities are not like that. Most communities are very white, very heteronormative, and it was very startling for me to move from a culture full of diversity of different backgrounds, colors, races, beliefs, and move into a community that was primarily white, middle and upper income folks, and very Christian. It was just a very different situation for me. And it was always very uncomfortable. So when I got into high school, I learned a lot about the law. My school had a trade school that associated with the high school. So I went into that for a criminal justice program and spent all of my time during my 4 years of high school in that program learning about the law. And I studied both racial and LGBT law history through the Supreme Court cases that have been through. So that was me all growing up. I just really wanted to learn and understand the way the world worked and understand why the South and the East was so different from the West Coast, and the cultures that were included and were given a voice and space. So when I went to college, I continued on that path. I worked and volunteered for the LGBT Center and the Multicultural Student Center at Appalachian State. I was a biology major, so I was really invested in learning about how to cultivate the earth, learning about climate change and the impact that various industries have on our climate. And one of my proudest moments of college was not graduating, but was when, if you all have followed a lot of LGBT law, in North Carolina several years ago when I was still in college, they passed what was called the trans bathroom ban. And they got a lot of really bad press for that, rightfully so. And my chancellor at my college was the only public school chancellor in North Carolina that did not say publicly that that law would not be enforced at our campus, and therefore was putting all of our trans students in an unsafe position. So what we did was we rallied multiple groups together. We marched around town and then took over the chancellor's building and slept there for a week until we could get her to make a public statement decrying that bill that was passed. So I went on to graduate. I moved here to Norfolk. I still work for nonprofits. I spent 2019, 2020 teaching in public school system here in Norfolk, and that was what I called my trigger moment to run for office, because in 2019 in December, I actually had a student in high school. He had a firearm on him and it went off in my classroom and he injured himself. And a month later, I had another student shot and killed by a gun, obviously. And that was a very traumatic few months for me. And then, 2 months later in March, we had COVID and everything shut down. And so through my processing, through really reflecting on my life, I decided that a run for office was the best way to make the most impact for my community and for all of Virginia as a whole. And what I really love about Virginia is it seems like we tend to set the stage for the southern states in terms of progressive policy. We're usually the first to promote or pass somewhat progressive bills. So I'm really excited about my run. I'm excited about the potential this has not only for people of Norfolk, people in Virginia, but people in the entire southern United States, all of whom are in desperate need of more progressive policies. So that's me. That's why I'm running. That's a little bit about my story. And again, thank you all so much for having me today.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all of that with us. I wish, as Alex said, that I could have been in your second grade class. That would have definitely been very fun.
I mean, I said that because I had a traumatic second grade experience, and it made Hannah's look like paradise.
Yeah, I'll say I had a very unique school that I went to. It was a public school, but I think it's a model of what I wish that every public school system had. Our teachers they had the resources and the funding they needed, thankfully, and it gave us a very enriching experience. So when we were learning about climate in science class, we were also reading climate stories in English and writing ourselves for writing and doing math problems associated with it in math. So they were really trying to hone us in throughout the curriculum. And yeah, it was a very special school. I wish every student had access, and they should all have access to schools like that. So yeah, absolutely, Alex.
Okay. Regarding climate change and environmental justice, and given your background in it, do you support the Green New Deal? And what specifically do you support within it? And how do you think it can be modified or expanded or even marketed to represent intersectional issues?
That's a great question. So yes, I do absolutely support it. Both the federal policy and for those of you not in Virginia, we did have a localized Virginia Green New Deal that was being pushed this past legislative session, which unfortunately, most of those bills, either within the Green New Deal bill or the associated bills that they kind of put along with it, did not make it to committee. So that was disappointing. So some of my favorite things within the Virginia Green New Deal were trying to make all of our public transport, including school buses and public buses, electric. I think that's great. And I know that there's something similar within the federal one as well, with the federal fleet being electric. I think that's brilliant. I think the only thing I'd love to see more specified within those bills is where the energy for those electric vehicles is coming from. I would love for it not to be from fossil fuels. That would be ideal. Something else that was loosely mentioned in our state Green New Deal, but I didn't really see it super panned out, was how we deal with people who are reliant on fossil fuels and how we move them over into more renewable sources. So my dad's side of the family, they're all from coal miner town. My grandfather was a coal miner. Most of my aunts and uncles are still in industries related to the coal industry in some capacity. And I know that that's really their biggest holdup in terms of moving into renewables, is they don't know what happens to their community and they're very afraid. And I think that that's a really rational fear to have, especially with our current political climate and media. It's really a lot of fear mongering on both sides about what's going on. And I think what would be really special is to be able to provide programs that support and teach students and people in those communities that have always gone into coal mining or into the oil fields, because it doesn't require a college degree. Allow them training and resources to be able to learn how to work on an electric grid, how to work on solar and wind, and just retrain the workforce that way. I think that would be really, really important. Along with all the other things, I love the concept of potentially carbon labeling or carbon taxing on things so that we can bump up prices on subsidized materials like factory farmed meat, like fossil fuels they're very cheap because we've subsidized them so much, and pushing those subsidies and hopefully taxes into communities where people really need support.
Okay, more of a somber note. This issue may come close to home, but it's a national issue that it's going on across the country. It's regarding gun control. Regarding gun control, what is your plan for gun control, and what do you think needs to be done in the state of Virginia, and not only Virginia but federally as well?
Sure. So I think what I would love to see in Virginia, people here love their guns. I would love a gun inventory project that is funded and run not only by the state, but by community organizations as well that are invested, but on both sides, both gun sense regulation folks and also the people who are trying to keep their guns. I think all voices need to be heard for us to progress forward in a real meaningful way. And I would love that inventory project to be implemented and funded so that we are aware of who has guns and how many and what kind that they have. I think that would really start building up a rapport with folks, that it's not people trying to take their guns. I mean, that's, a debated issue on whether I would love for there not to be guns. But in a realistic world, I think that's the best first step, is to make sure we know where they are, who has them, and how many there are. And obviously, that's not going to get around the ones that are, stolen or traded under the table, which was the case in my classroom. It was a student. He shouldn't have had it anyway. He's too young. It made it off the premises to who knows where. I don't know where that is now. And clearly an inventory project probably wouldn't figure that out. But I think that's a good first step. I also think we need to start at a federal level, making sure that we are understanding where these more high-powered assault type rifles are, and trying to try to get those back, because no one needs those. Those are entirely meant to hurt a lot of people. And something that happens here in Norfolk is, a lot of children are being killed either by crossfire, or other kids have guns, they don't know how to use them, and we end up with 6-year-olds being shot on playgrounds, which has happened here in the past few months. So I think that both of those measures are really important first steps. In terms of a wide reaching policy, I think that that's something that would require a lot more studies. I would love to see more studies on it. But what I can say is, when I went to Australia in college for my thesis project, what I learned was they had 1 or 2 mass shooting incidents and immediately took away guns. It's an extremely intensive process to be able to even get a gun, and you're only allowed to request to have certain guns or apply for them if you live in specific areas. For example, if you live in higher populated areas like Sydney or Melbourne, it's nearly impossible to get a firearm. Whereas if you live in the outback, you have a lot of land, there's potential that you'll encounter, animals that could hurt you or something like that. you're more likely to be able to at least get something like a handgun or a rifle. So it's very determinant on your situation, and there's intensive processing to be able to get access. And I think that that's something we need to really consider here. But I do know our culture around firearms and weapons in America and in Virginia and its own is much different than the rest of the world. So I try to keep that in mind when I think about my gun policies.
Thank you. To lighten it up just a little bit, this is more of a fun question, but what is your favorite TV show and movie and snack to accompany it?
Wow. Okay, let's see. My favorite TV show. I don't know. I feel like I have so many. Right now we're watching Breaking Bad because I've never seen it. But I really love baking shows. I think they're just very relaxing. So I tend to fall into like baking shows or like house decorating shows. I think they're very calming. And snacks, I really love popcorn. That's like one of my favorite snacks. It's quick and yeah, warm or cold, whatever you want it to be. It's good for the summer or the winter. And I always have tea. I always have tea with me. So I'll include that as well.
Okay, well, our next question comes close to home to, I know Alex here and myself, is regarding disabilities issues. What is your stance on disabilities issues, more so inclusiveness and accessibility? And what will you do as our next delegate to make the district more accessible for folks with disability and make schools and employers more inclusive for folks with disabilities, especially with the whole Medicaid waivers?
Sure, that's a really great question, and something that's really important to me. When I was teaching, I taught a lot of special ed students. I had co-taught classes, which were a mix of general pop and students that were differently abled, and they were the highlight of my day. I loved all of my students, and it was very frustrating for me that my support teachers that were specialized in working with children of differently abled abilities and different learning tactics, that they did not have the resources and the funding that they needed to do their job effectively. So in terms of education, I think that would be my primary focus, is ensuring that there is proper funding and additional funding for those specific students that need additional support, and for the teachers that are supporting them. I think that that was the biggest inequity I saw. And I would also love to see more support at a younger age as well, and making sure that we're testing students of all races, because something that happened a lot, I can say at least in Norfolk, but from my understanding it happens pretty widely, is white students tend to get labeled or get identified early on with their disabilities or their differences, whereas students of color tend to just they get labeled as being disobedient or disruptive, and they are not given the same resources and the same support, and they end up struggling. And by the time they get to high school and they are properly identified and are able to be given their services properly, it's a little, they're already struggling. They're already very frustrated with school, and that's just not something that's acceptable. So that's what I would love to see in the education system. In terms of the workforce, I think it's important to have similar resources and support in the workplace as well. I think, everyone has these support structures for all different reasons. And I think we need to make sure we're including different learning styles, different cognitive functions. I think everything needs to be included in terms of disability. And then with physical disabilities, in terms of, my grandmother has MS. I've seen her struggle trying to get on and off sidewalks. I've seen her not being able to enjoy the things that we do as a family with us because she just doesn't have the same access. So I think ensuring that people with physical differences as well have access, and that is included into their insurance plans or Medicare, whatever it might be. I've gotten really disgusted with the GoFundMe culture of trying to get people access to wheelchairs and support in their own homes because they have to pay for it somehow in order just to live. I think that should be definitely included within our healthcare system.
tell us more about your plan to create jobs in your community.
Sure, that's great. So I think that ties in a lot with my ideas around climate and the proposed Virginia Green New Deal bills. We're currently in the process of approving and building offshore wind here. I think that's a great opportunity to create more jobs. Norfolk itself needs a lot of infrastructure buildup. Something that I've talked a lot about is the city gives a lot of funding to the areas that are already higher income and already look beautiful and are structurally sound. And as soon as you leave those neighborhoods, it's literally like you can see like the box around them. They have trees, they have grass, everything's neat and tidy. And you cross outside of their boundary and the streets are cracking, there's no trees, the houses are crumbling. And it's because we keep pouring money into these areas that are already beautiful, already taken care of, with people who have the means and the resources to upkeep. We're not taking care of the communities that need a little more support. And so I think creating more jobs that enrich the communities that are already there are really important. So I'd love to see increased funding for jobs within the nonprofit sphere, increased funding for community leaders. I'd love to see more community gardens, more ways of bringing renewable energy sources. And much like I said with the coal country, where I want trades to be accessible that are not associated with the fossil fuel industry, I think we could do the same thing here in Norfolk. I think we could create jobs that are trades that don't require expensive college education, which I would also love to see free college education. But I think we can do that in a way that's equitable, keep people in our community and bring money and flourish, within our community. I don't think people need to leave. They shouldn't have to leave just to get jobs. So I think we should keep job creation within our progress forward in other areas as well.
Our next question is another great issue, is paid internships. Do you support paid internships, and will you commit to paying interns?
Yes, so I absolutely do believe in paid internships. And with my race, my race is interesting. I'm running against someone who's also running for Attorney General and is our current delegate. And it's been a little bit of a struggle trying to fundraise against him. So at this point, I don't have enough funding as a very small campaign to pay anyone. So I try, I don't give people tasks that would be outside of the scope of a traditional volunteer level role. I'm trying not to give out tasks that require hours and hours and hours of work. I would love to get to the point, and it is one of my goals while I'm fundraising, to fundraise enough to support those the people who are interning or volunteering and wanting to do a little bit more within the campaign. I know I could use their support, and I want to support them as well. So yes, I do commit to paying. At this point, I'm basically bearing the burden myself until I have enough funds to be able to pay people in a really meaningful way. I appreciate that question. That's a great one.
Thank you. This is going to seem a bit outright, but what is your stance on the death penalty?
I disagree with it wholeheartedly, and I am endlessly grateful that Virginia has abolished it this past session.
Okay, I'm going to now be opening the floor up for any audience questions. And as a reminder, if you just want to ask a question, please turn on your video and unmute yourself, or you could also type your questions in the chat and Tura will read it out for you.
Well, I definitely, I did ask a question in the email, but I'll go ahead and state it now. So as someone who has been abused in the school systems, I'm curious to know if you'll stand up to folks like that are affiliated with questionable places such as Autism Speaks, Applied Behavioral Analysis, as well as certain teacher unions that have referred to us as the R word. I thought that was very inappropriate and ableist. So I was wondering if you'd be willing to fight that if you get elected.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And, that's something that the more problematic autistic organizations, I guess we can call them, I was not aware of that until right before I started teaching. And it's something I've been actively trying to educate myself on. And yes, absolutely. I think any organization that is problematic within what they're actually trying to help needs to be stood up to. And I think that's really a part of the problem with all of politics, and honestly, a lot of nonprofits. I said I work in the nonprofit sphere. I deal with it professionally as well. Groups that are trying, they're saying they're standing up for a group, they're saying they're advocating, but their actions do exactly the opposite. So yes, 100%. If anyone is being, hurt or disproportionately targeted through someone's work, that's unacceptable, and we have to do better than that. And I'm really sorry that you had that experience.
That's okay. I mean, that's why I do what I do, because that all these folks will come up with clever rhetoric on, there's no need to speak the truth to the autism community, just try to find ways to win arguments. And they've done that through seclusion. So it's good to know that people are on our side.
Absolutely.
I have a question.
Sure.
How would you go about providing, or what are your plans, I guess, for providing more accessible healthcare? I know you sort of touched upon this when we were talking about disabilities, inclusiveness, and accessibility. But how would you go about making like plans or policies for it in Virginia and also just on the federal level?
Sure. So in terms of making it accessible, I know Medicare and Medicaid are federal programs. So as a delegate, I wouldn't have much control over that, but I always have and would continue to, even if I don't get elected into my position, continue pressuring my elected officials to push for Medicare for all. I think that's so important. And it's something that, when I've traveled, my grandparents were immigrants from Italy. When I go back to visit the rest of my family who still lives there, it's something that they can't even comprehend, that we all have to be afraid to go to the doctor or afraid to go to the hospital when something is wrong, because you have to choose between paying your rent or buying food for your family or getting healthcare that you need to live. And that's unacceptable. So yes, I think that we really need to just increase our funding and accessibility, much like with voting rights. We need to make sure that people are aware of the programs that do exist currently for them within the state, within Medicare, continue pushing them to register, continue pushing them to know their rights within that system, while simultaneously, as a state elected official and just a citizen, pushing federal electeds to pass these bills and these laws that need to be put in place. So yeah, that's definitely something that's really important to me. And in terms of specific policy, I haven't really seen anything that like stands out as something super, like a great way to go about it. So it's something I am admittedly still actively trying to wrap my head around as to what would be the best step forward. But I know what I'd like to see. And so learning more about how this could look, I think, is important, and making sure to identify areas of weakness. So I know, women of color, specifically Black women, have the highest mortality rates, especially when pregnant. I think that needs to be addressed. I think we need to address the mistrust within the BIPOC communities with the medical field. We need to make, besides just the funding for things like Medicare for all, we need to make actual healthcare accessible to people. And I know that there's a huge mistrust that is, goes back to the days of enslavement of people, that is deep rooted. And I know that there are communities that just do not trust the healthcare system, and rightfully so. I think that's part of access to healthcare as well, is helping people in the medical field understand the damage that's been done, and actively implementing anti-racist and more equitable stances and policies within their own field to make people feel understood, to make sure that they're being listened to. And we have to get those mortality rates down. We have to build back that trust between BIPOC communities and and the healthcare system. And I think that that will probably be a long-term process. And I would love to see that happen in addition to the funding piece as well. So I hope that that answered your question, but that's just kind of where my mind went with that.
Great, so we have time for a couple more questions. The next question we have is, can you address Virginia's housing crisis? And as delegate, what will you do to address housing crisis in Virginia, especially in Norfolk?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Norfolk is part of this area called Hampton Roads. Hampton Roads has the highest eviction rates in the state right now, and they're getting worse. And in my district and my neighbors, they're literally next to my my apartment, is a community called St. Paul's. And St. Paul's is a historic public housing community. It's been around since the 50s. And the city is currently beginning to knock all of the buildings down. Over nearly 16,000 people live there, and they're all being, you know, slowly evicted from their houses and only given a housing voucher, which is up to landlords to accept. And it's really hard to get landlords to accept those housing vouchers. So what we're seeing is 16,000 people are ending up on the streets or may just not have any place to go. And I don't know what this looks like statewide, but I know that affordable housing is a problem statewide. I'm not sure with evictions, but I think we need rent control first and foremost. We also need something that I think is the best term for it is a tenant's bill of rights. So we need a document that outlines the rights of tenants. A problem in Norfolk that I can speak to specifically is our apartments are owned by, you know, a couple wealthy people who own a lot of the buildings, or a few management companies that also own, you know, the rest of them. And what happens is they rent them at extremely high rates because we have the biggest naval base in the world. So there's a lot of military coming in. And the way that military housing works is based on your rank and your family, if you're married, if you have children, you're allotted a specific amount of money that the military will pay for you to rent. And you can max that out. So what happens is a lot of the landlords and management companies know that max dollar, and everything gets rented up to there, which might not seem like a problem, but for everybody else, that becomes a really big problem. And when you have management companies that also are basically running, this is something someone told me, so I'm going to reuse their word. They said that they're living in a slum condition. They have roaches, rats, cracks in the walls, leaky windows, and they're paying over $1,000 to live in this place that's literally falling apart. And when they flush their toilets, the sewage runs out into the yard. It's disgusting, and people should not be living that way. I think we need rent control. We need a tenant's bill of rights. And we also need to raise our minimum wage in the state, since it seems to be a challenge at the federal level. Because if people have a livable wage, if they're making a minimum wage that is hopefully $15, I would love to see more. They can afford better housing, and it will push those landlords to improve their conditions and maintain a standard that is livable and safe. So that's just a start of addressing this problem. I think it's a much bigger problem that we could probably talk about on our own for an hour. But those are my starting points of what I think would begin to help mitigate that.
Right, so does anyone from the audience have any questions? Okay, so I had one other question for you. It's regarding women's rights, since it is the ERA passed next month or last month. And so my question is, what is your stance on women's rights, and what is your plan to address the issue in the General Assembly?
Sure. So I think, this is an issue that we all talk about a lot. And as a white woman, I feel slightly uncomfortable because I feel like white women have been given, we've been given such a platform here. So for me personally, I would just love to see more women of color and more non-cis straight women of color even. I would love to see just more non-white straight women coming into leadership positions and being given that space and those platforms to share their stories, share their visions, and share their ideas. Because I think women, and especially women of color, and especially here in Norfolk, they are the foundation of society. And I say that because the women that were there for me growing up, my non-biological aunties, those women really instilled such beautiful values and beliefs in me, because they come from cultures that tend to not be male centric. They have these different beliefs. They have these beautiful, I don't know, I wish that women of color were given more of a platform to stand on, because everyone just brings so much value. And that would be a goal of mine, is to see that. I work professionally within the animal welfare, animal rights area. And that's a huge problem for us. Women in general really aren't given a space to speak there in leadership, but women of color, it's even harder. And so I think that this is something we need to start fostering and building. So I'd love to see community programs that uplift specifically girls of color. I would love to see more access to leadership building, more access to, training women, teaching women how to be effective leaders, and using their own stories, their own voices, tied with those leadership skills to bring change. We see people like Cori Bush, we see people like Ilhan Omar, we see all these women that come from beautiful backgrounds, and we need those voices, because that is where true progress lies. So I hope that was that was a long-winded answer, but yeah.
A question from me in terms of what are your stances on the legalization of marijuana?
Sure, that's a great question. So we just legalized it here in Virginia. And unfortunately, the General Assembly voted today on a bill that basically creates new offenses within the legalization, and they're mostly targeted at children. So for Virginia specifically, what I think is important is that as we are, and I guess for other states, as we are legalizing, we need to do it in an appropriate, equitable way. We can't decriminalize it or legalize it, but then target new groups of people within the legalization. So I think that's something that will probably need to be, it will come about as more states go through this and we kind of start seeing what's going on. But yeah, I think that we need to make sure that as we're legalizing, we're doing it effectively, that we're expunging folks' records who have past offenses, and that we're not recreating new offenses that will most likely continue to disproportionately target youth of color. So that's kind of where I am now as I'm learning and watching this evolve today here in Virginia. And I also had someone in Colorado reach out to me recently about this, because, they've had it legalized for a while there. Virginia is now new to that group of legalized states. And she was saying that there's been a problem with the potency. And so now they're trying to consider putting limits on the potency level of the marijuana that's being sold. So that's something I'm going to be looking into. I literally just talked to her before this, so I'm going to continue educating myself on that. But that's something new that I want to make sure I'm well versed in, because I think this is how we create laws and bills that are effective and equitable, by understanding what's gone wrong in other places that have already done this before us. And by listening to the communities that feel like they're going to be targeted, which right now a lot of youth are speaking out saying this sounds like more dangerous for us, this new bill. So
Great, so now I'm gonna ask the final question, then we'll let you say some closing remarks, and then Ashi will close us out. So our last question is, a lot of people here want to get involved in local politics, but are unsure where to start. What advice would you have for young folks about getting involved, and what can young people who want to increase their participation in politics do in your district or help your campaign?
That's a wonderful question. I think the best way to start getting involved is to just find ways to volunteer or find those paid internships where you can. I think that that's the best way to go about it. And I can say, as a young progressive candidate that's, not bringing in hundreds of thousands of dollars on her campaign, those valuable people that step up and really believe in the work that you're doing, those are the best people to know. And they're the best people to have on your side. And, I'm fairly young, I'm 26, and I know that the people even younger than me have incredible ideas, and we really are the world changers. And I think we're starting to see that happen. We're starting to see younger people getting elected into office. We're seeing younger people working on campaigns and younger people demanding things of their elected officials that before we really didn't do. And I think that that's really key. So whether you're volunteering on a campaign or you're doing the work that you all are doing, hosting candidates, asking questions, rallying up fellow youth and peers, all of that's really important. And if you can't do that, if you're not ready for that, even just reaching out to your elected officials when bills are coming across the table and you agree or disagree with them, let them know, because it really does matter. And I work a little bit in policy for my job, and I've been told multiple times that if an elected official gets 2 or 3 emails from a constituent in their district or in their region, that really does make a difference to them. So if you can just send them an email or a text if they have that and just let them know, hey, this bill sounds horrible. Can you please vote no? That's so important. And I think that would go, that goes a long way. So use your voice however you can, in whatever capacity you're able. I think that's the most important. And from a older young person to younger young people, always know your value and your worth, and don't settle for less. Know that you bring so much value to any person that you're working with or for, and demand the respect and the dignity that you are deserving of.
Great, so we'll leave it to you for a few closing remarks, then my colleague Ashi will close this out.
Sure. Well, thank you all so much for having me. This was a pleasure. If any of you know anyone that lives in the 89th district, which is part of Norfolk, send them my way. We're actively engaging and getting virtual petition signatures, it's all on my Facebook link, as well as my Twitter and everything else. So please find it there, send it to your friends. And yeah, ask me any questions, send me ideas. I'm open to conversing. If you want to set up a video call, I'm happy to do it. Yeah, we all have to work together. This change really happens when we work together. And so I think that that's really valuable. Whether or not you live in Norfolk or Virginia, you could live in California, it doesn't matter. All of our voices lift each other up, and really they bring the real change. So thank you all for having me.
Thank you to all the participants who could make it today. And thank you again, Hannah, so much for your time. We thoroughly enjoyed hearing all of your responses and wish you the very best in your campaign.